We begin, as we so often do, with a truth that is hard to hear. At 21 years old, Clara Whitfield had nowhere left to sleep. She had been put out of her uncle's house that very morning, told plainly by Thaddeus Mercer that a grown woman with no husband and no wages was a mouth he would no longer feed. All she carried into the world was $6.40 sewn into the hem of her coat, and a small tin box of her late mother's sewing needles. With that $6.40, she did something the whole town of Gulls Rest, Maine, would call foolish. Before the week was out, she walked into the county courthouse and bought, for $9 borrowed against a promise of future wages, the abandoned Widow's Point Lighthouse, condemned and empty for 11 years. She told herself it was shelter. She did not yet know that beneath its crumbling stairs lay letters that would not only save her life, but would return to an entire town of grieving families something they believed the sea had swallowed forever. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Clara Whitfield. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten by everyone else, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. We'd love to know we're not so far apart after all. Clara had been born 14 years before the century's turn, in a narrow shingled house that looked out over the cold grey water of the Gulf of Maine, in a fishing town called Gulls Rest that clung to its rocky coast the way barnacles cling to a hull, stubbornly, and without complaint. Her father, Josiah Whitfield, had kept the light at Widow's Point for 18 years, climbing its spiral stairs each evening with an oil can and a patience that never seemed to tire, and her mother, Ruth, had taken in mending and darning for half the fishing families in town, teaching Clara from the time she could hold a needle that a stitch done properly was a promise kept. Clara remembered her childhood less as a string of events than as a texture, the smell of lamp oil and salt rope, the particular hush of fog rolling over the point at dusk, her father's low voice counting the ships home one by one as their lanterns bobbed into the harbor. He used to tell her that a lighthouse keeper's whole duty could be summed up in a single sentence: you do not let the dark win, even when no one is watching to thank you for it. It was a sentence she would carry with her long after she had any lighthouse left to tend. Her mother taught her another kind of faith altogether, the practical faith of hands that worked. Ruth Whitfield had a gift for taking apart a threadbare coat and finding, somewhere in its seams, enough good cloth to make it whole again, and she taught Clara that nothing in this world was truly ruined until you had turned it over and looked at every side of it. Waste, she used to say, biting a thread between her teeth, is just impatience wearing a fancy name. Clara absorbed this the way a child absorbs the rhythm of a hymn, without knowing yet what use she would have for it. She grew up mending nets alongside the fishermen's wives, learning to read tide charts from the old harbor master, and sitting for long evenings at her father's side in the lamp room, watching him polish the great lens until it threw its beam clean and hard across the black water. She loved that lamp room more than any room she ever stood in afterward. She loved the particular silence of it, broken only by the turning of the mechanism and the far crash of waves against granite, and she loved the feeling, rare enough in a girl's life at the time, of being entrusted with something that mattered. It was the wreck of the merchant vessel Morning Star, in the bitter November of Clara's 14th year, that broke that world in two. The ship went down in a storm just off Widow's Point with 11 men aboard, 6 of them sons and husbands of Gulls Rest, and in the terrible weeks that followed, whispers began to circulate that the light had failed that night, that Josiah Whitfield, drunk or careless or simply asleep at his post, had let the beam go dark at the very hour the Morning Star needed it most. Clara remembered her father's face during those weeks, grey and drawn and strangely quiet, a man absorbing blows he did not seem able to answer. He swore before the harbor board that the light had burned steady all that night, that the fault lay not with him but with the ship's own owner, a merchant named Silas Calloway, who had sent the Morning Star out overloaded and undermanned against Josiah's own written warning. But Calloway was a man of standing in Gulls Rest, a deacon of the church and the largest employer of dock labor in 3 counties, and Josiah Whitfield was, in the end, only a keeper of lamps. The board stripped him of his post within the month. He died the following spring, found at the base of the lighthouse stairs on a foggy morning, his neck broken in what the county coroner called a simple, tragic fall. Ruth Whitfield followed him into the ground not 2 winters later, worn down by grief and fever both, and Clara, not yet 17, was taken in, out of obligation more than love, by her mother's brother, Thaddeus Mercer, a dry, thin-lipped man who ran the ship chandlery on Harbor Street and who never once, in 4 long years, let her forget that she was a debt he was paying rather than a niece he was raising. Those 4 years in Thaddeus Mercer's house taught Clara a different lesson than her parents had, though she would not understand its purpose until much later. She learned to make herself small and useful at once, to keep her opinions folded away like good linen, to work from before dawn until well past dark stocking rope and rigging and canvas in her uncle's shop for no wage beyond her keep. She learned, too, a strange and specific silence in that house whenever the name Calloway came up at the supper table, a stiffening in her uncle's shoulders, a too quick change of subject, that she noticed the way a sailor notices a change in wind before he can name the storm behind it. She did not think much of it then. She had other things to survive. But she would remember it later, and it would matter more than anything else she carried out of that house. The fall, when it came quickly and without ceremony. Thaddeus Mercer's chandlery had been failing quietly for 2 years, undercut by a larger supply house that Silas Calloway himself had financed on the mainland, and in the spring of Clara's 21st year, her uncle sold the last of his stock, settled what debts he could, and told her over a cold breakfast that he could no longer keep her. He said it the way a man reads a shipping manifest, without heat, as though she were simply a line item he was striking through. He gave her no money, no letter of reference, nothing but the coat on her back and the tin box of needles her mother had left her, and by noon that same day she stood on Harbor Street with the whole of her life reduced to $6.40 and nowhere in the world that was hers to go. She walked the length of the harbor twice that afternoon, past the boarding house she could not afford, past the church whose deacon was the very man her father had named as the true cause of the Morning Star's loss, past the docks where men she had known her whole life looked away rather than meet her eye, as though poverty were a contagion they feared to catch by kindness. It was nearly dusk, and a cold rain had begun needling in off the water, when she found herself standing before the county notice board outside the courthouse, reading, without quite meaning to, an auction notice for a parcel of condemned coastal property, the old Widow's Point Lighthouse and its keeper's cottage, deeded to the county 11 years prior when the light was decommissioned in favor of a new automated beacon on Gull's Rest Point, to be sold that very afternoon to whoever would clear the back taxes owed upon it. She stood before that notice for a long while, the rain soaking through her collar, and something in her, grief, perhaps, or memory, or simple desperation, made her walk inside and ask the clerk what such a sale required. The clerk, an elderly man named Whitcomb who had known her father, looked at her with something between pity and surprise and told her the back taxes came to $9 even, payable that day, and that no one else had troubled to bid on a ruin so far gone that half the town believed it haunted. Clara had $6.40. She asked, with a steadiness she did not entirely feel, whether he would accept the balance against a promissory note, to be paid from wages she did not yet have from work she had not yet found, and old Whitcomb, perhaps out of memory of Josiah Whitfield's honest years of service, perhaps simply out of pity for a soaked and hollow-eyed young woman with nowhere else to turn, agreed. She signed her name to the note with a hand that trembled from cold rather than doubt, and walked out of that courthouse the legal owner of a condemned lighthouse that every soul in Gull's Rest considered worthless, foolish, and quite possibly cursed. It was, by any sensible measure, the act of a young woman with nothing left to lose making a decision that had nothing sensible about it at all. She reached Widow's Point as the last grey light was failing, and stood a long moment at the base of the tower looking up at its dark, salt-scoured stones, feeling less like an owner than like a trespasser in her own childhood. The keeper's cottage beside it had lost half its roof to 11 winters of neglect, but the tower itself, granite through and through, stood as stubborn and unmoved as it had the whole of her life, and something in its stubbornness steadied her enough to push open the swollen door and step inside. The air within smelled of dust and cold stone and, faintly, of the lamp oil that had once burned there, a smell that struck her so suddenly with memory that she had to stand still a moment with her hand against the wall. She spent that first night wrapped in her coat on the lower landing of the spiral stairs, too exhausted and too cold to climb further, and it was only the next morning, searching for dry wood to build some small fire, that she noticed the stair beneath her had a give to it that no sound stair should have, a slight hollow knock where her heel struck the third step from the bottom, different from the solid ring of the stone steps above it. It took her the better part of an hour, working with a rusted pry bar she found among the cottage's ruined tools, to work the riser free, and when it finally gave way with a groan of old wood, she found beneath it a shallow compartment, dry despite the years, holding a bundle of letters wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a length of the same waxed cord her father had always kept coiled by the lamp-room door. Her hands were shaking again, not from cold this time, as she untied that cord and unfolded the first letter and saw, in ink gone brown but unmistakably legible, her own father's careful, deliberate hand. The letters, 31 of them in all, dated across the 11 months before Josiah Whitfield's death, told a story that Clara had to read twice before she let herself believe it. They were not addressed to her mother, nor to any single person, but written, it seemed, as a kind of testimony, a record her father had kept, page by page, in case he did not live to speak the truth aloud himself. He wrote of the letter he had sent to Silas Calloway's shipping office 3 weeks before the Morning Star sailed, warning that the vessel was dangerously overloaded and her hull unsound below the waterline, and of Calloway's reply, brief and cold, instructing him to mind his lamp and leave the loading of ships to men who understood commerce. He wrote of the night of the wreck itself, insisting again and again, as though bracing for a fight he knew was coming, that the light had burned true and steady from dusk until dawn, that he had climbed those stairs himself every 2 hours to trim the wick and check the mechanism exactly as he always did. And in the later letters, written in the desperate months after the harbor board stripped him of his post, he wrote something Clara had never dared imagine, that Calloway, faced with the certainty of a ruinous lawsuit from the widows of the drowned men, had quietly paid an insurance settlement far larger than the wreck's true value, on the sole condition that the money never be traced back to any admission of fault, and that Josiah himself, approached in secret, had been offered a portion of that settlement to sign a statement admitting the light had failed. He refused it. He wrote that he would rather die a disgraced man with a clean conscience than a comfortable one with a lie in his mouth, and in the final letter, dated only 4 days before his death, he wrote that he had hidden the whole of the money Calloway had tried to press upon him, declining it for himself but unable, in good conscience, to return it to a man who would only use it to silence some other honest voice, intending instead to give it, in time, to the very widows and orphans it was meant to buy silence from, once he could find a way to do so without implicating himself in a bribe he had never accepted. Clara sat on that cold stone floor for what felt like hours, the letters spread around her like a fan of dried leaves, and felt something shift inside her chest that was not quite grief and not quite rage but some steadier, harder thing assembled out of both. Her father had not failed. He had not been careless, nor drunk, nor asleep. He had been honest in a town too frightened of a rich man's displeasure to let that honesty stand, and he had died. She could not now think of it as a mere fall, carrying a secret heavy enough to crush a lesser man long before the stairs ever did. She spent that whole day reading the letters again, then a third time, searching for any hint of where the hidden money itself might be, and it was near dusk, running her fingers once more along the empty compartment beneath the stair, that she found, tucked into a fold of the oilcloth she had nearly overlooked, a small hand-drawn map in her father's script, marking a spot beneath the lamp-room floor itself, and beside it, in his same careful hand, 4 words, for the 6 families. It took her 2 more days of careful, aching work, prying up floorboards she had to hope would not simply cave the whole room in on her, before she found the strongbox, small, iron-bound, and locked, but light enough that she knew at once it held paper rather than coin, and inside it. When she finally forced the hasp with her pry bar, she found not gold but something in its way more valuable, a full ledger of names and sums, $3,100 in bankers' drafts made out, blank, to be filled in and cashed by whoever presented them along with proof of claim, and a signed, notarized statement from Calloway's own shipping clerk, a man named Amos Teague, who had since left Gull's Rest for reasons no one had ever explained, attesting under oath that the Morning Star had sailed that November with cargo weight nearly double what her hull was rated to bear, against the written objection of her own lighthouse keeper. Clara understood, sitting there in the fading light with that ledger open across her knees, that she was holding not merely her father's vindication but the literal, overdue debt owed to 6 families in Gull's Rest who had spent 11 years believing their husbands and sons had died because a keeper failed his post, families who had, in some cases, shunned her own father's memory, who had crossed the street rather than speak to her mother in her last fevered winter, who had every reason in the world to doubt whatever a Whitfield now told them. She understood, too, that the man who had built the whole of his standing in Gull's Rest on the ruin of her father's name was still very much alive, still a deacon of the church, still, as it happened, the newly elected mayor of the town, and that a young woman with no money, no family standing, and a boarded-up lighthouse to her name would not find it easy to be believed against him. She began, in the weeks that followed, moving with a patience she had learned from her mother's needle and a stubbornness she had learned from her father's lamp. She did not run to the harbor board waving letters, knowing full well how such a thing would look coming from an embittered orphan with an obvious grievance. Instead she went first, quietly, to old Whitcomb at the courthouse. Showing him only the notarized clerk's statement and asking, without explaining its origin, whether such a document would carry weight before the county magistrate. She went to the 6 families named in the ledger one at a time, not with accusations but with careful, humble questions about what they remembered of that November, listening far more than she spoke, letting old wounds breathe a little before she ever mentioned what she had found. She spent her evenings by lamplight in the cottage, cross-referencing every name in her father's ledger against the parish register, tracking down a widow who had remarried and moved inland, locating the grown son of a drowned fisherman now working the mainland docks himself, building, patiently, methodically, the way she had once mended a torn net stitch by stitch, a case that could not be waved away as a grieving girl's fancy. It was inevitable, in a town as small as Gull's Rest, that word of her quiet inquiries reached Silas Calloway before she was ready for it to, and it was Thaddeus Mercer, of all people, who carried it to him, her own uncle, still bound, she would later understand, by a decade-old debt of silence to the very man who had ruined her father, having accepted a quiet loan from Calloway's mainland supply house years before to keep his failing chandlery afloat a while longer, on the unspoken understanding that certain questions about the Morning Star would never again be raised in his household. Calloway came to Widow's Point himself on a raw spring evening, dressed in the fine dark coat of a man accustomed to being obeyed, and stood at the base of the tower Clara was slowly, board by board, trying to make livable again, and told her, in the mild and reasonable tone of a man who believes reasonableness to be its own form of threat, that a young woman alone would do well not to go stirring up grief that decent people had long since laid to rest. He offered, in the same breath, to buy the Lighthouse property from her outright at 3 times what she owed on it, framing it as an act of Christian charity toward an orphan with no prospects. Clara understood, standing there with the ledger's existence still her only real advantage, that the offer was not charity at all but the price of her silence, dressed in a deacon's language, and she told him, quietly, but without the tremor she had felt on the courthouse steps months before, that she had not asked to sell, and did not intend to. Calloway's mildness did not survive that answer. In the weeks that followed, Clara found herself facing a slower, colder kind of opposition than any single confrontation, a sudden difficulty securing lumber on credit for her cottage repairs, a rumor circulating the general store that she had been seen acting strangely up at the lighthouse and might do well to be looked into by the county, even a visit from a county health inspector, clearly sent rather than summoned, who found the cottage roof a danger to public safety and threatened condemnation proceedings that would strip the property from her within the month. Thaddeus Mercer, too, appeared at her door one evening, not to apologize but to warn her, in his old dry voice, that she was a fool to fight a man like Calloway, that some debts were better left buried with the men who owed them, and Clara understood then, with a clarity that hurt more than it angered, that her own uncle had known some part of the truth all along and had chosen comfort over honesty, the same choice the whole town had made 11 years before. But Clara had spent a lifetime learning that a thing was not ruined simply because it looked ruined to men in a hurry to look away, and she used the weeks of mounting pressure not to retreat but to finish what she had started, gathering her 6 families' sworn testimonies, matching them against the ledger's blank drafts, and carrying the whole of it. Letters, ledger, clerk's statement, and testimonies together, not to the county magistrate first, but to the one place in Gull's Rest that Silas Calloway could not quietly silence, the open floor of the town meeting, held that spring in the very church hall where he sat as deacon, on an evening he himself, in an irony Clara noted with some grim satisfaction, had called to discuss funding for a new town breakwater. She rose to speak near the meeting's end, when half the hall had already begun gathering their coats, and asked only for 10 minutes, invoking her father's name and 18 years of honest service before she had said another word, enough, in a room that still remembered Josiah Whitfield however uncertainly, to still the shuffling feet and win her that 10 minutes. She read from the clerk Amos Teague's notarized statement first, letting the sworn weight of another man's words carry what her own testimony alone could not, and watched Calloway's face go the color of old ash as she read on. She read her father's own last letter next, the one written 4 days before his death, refusing a bribe he would rather die honest than accept, and she watched, in the silence that followed, several of the 6 families she had spoken with in the preceding weeks rise quietly from their seats: Hetty Doyle, whose husband had drowned aboard the Morning Star, and young Silas Foss, named, she noted with some private irony, for the very man who had orphaned him, standing now to say plainly that they had known Josiah Whitfield's honesty all their lives and had let grief make them forget it. She did not ask for punishment. She asked only that the drafts in her father's ledger be honored, that the truth of the Morning Star's loss be entered into the town's own record, and that the light at Widow's Point, silent now for 11 years, be relit, not as a working beacon, the automated light on Gull's Rest Point having long since made it obsolete for shipping, but as what she called a keeping light, tended each evening in her father's memory, so that no family in Gull's Rest would ever again have cause to wonder whether someone was watching over the dark water on their behalf. Silas Calloway did not go to prison, nor did the town run him from Gull's Rest with torches, for Clara had asked for none of that, believing her father would not have wished it either. But he resigned his post as mayor within the month, unable to survive the quiet, total withdrawal of the town's trust once the truth was entered into its own records in his own church hall, and he sold his shipping interests within the year to a mainland concern, leaving Gull's Rest a diminished man in a town that no longer needed his approval to know its own history. Thaddeus Mercer never apologized outright, being too proud or too ashamed for that, but he came quietly to Widow's Point one autumn evening not long after, bringing with him the old family Bible that had belonged to Ruth Whitfield, which he had kept without ever once mentioning it, and set it on Clara's table without a word, which she understood, in its way, to be the only apology he had left in him to give. Clara used the $3,100 exactly as her father's ledger had marked it, for the 6 families it was owed to, keeping not a cent for herself beyond what she needed to finish repairing the keeper's cottage roof, and she took work, in the years that followed, mending nets and sails for the harbor same as her mother once had, while each evening, without fail, she climbed the spiral stairs of Widow's Point and lit the old lamp, polished now to the same hard clean shine her father had always kept it, its beam falling once more across the black water of the point that bore its name, not to guide any ship, for none needed guiding there any longer, but to keep a promise her father had made in a single sentence she had carried with her the whole of her life: you do not let the dark win. Even when no one is watching to thank you for it. And so we return, as we always do, to where we began, to a 21-year-old woman standing rain-soaked before a courthouse notice board with $6.40 to her name, buying for $9 a ruin that the whole of Gull's Rest believed worthless. It was never really the lighthouse Clara Whitfield had purchased that gray afternoon, though it took her some time to understand this herself. It was a stair that had waited 11 patient years to be walked upon by the one person in the world who would think to knock her heel against its hollow board, and beneath it, a father's last honest testimony, waiting for a daughter with the same stubborn faith to carry it the rest of the way home. What the town of Gull's Rest called foolish that spring, it came in time to call something closer to grace, and Clara Whitfield, who had lost everything a person can lose and been given nothing back but an abandoned tower and a box of dry old letters, proved that the truest inheritance a parent can leave a child is not money nor property, but the simple, stubborn habit of refusing to look away from what is right, however long the dark around it lasts. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us, and with Clara. If her story moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need to hear it today, and we'd love to know, in the comments below, what is a time you found real value in something the rest of the world had already written off. Until next time, stay close.